As I entered the house that evening, I was taken aback to find Rebecca crying at the kitchen table. This was completely unlike her. My stepmother, Rebecca, had always maintained a calm and somewhat distant demeanor. She wasn't the type to let her emotions overflow like this. Yet, there she was, her shoulders trembling, her face hidden in her hands, sobbing quietly. For a moment, I stood frozen. The soft light in the kitchen illuminated her figure, and the air felt charged with unspoken words. I had the urge to turn around and leave, to pretend I hadn't witnessed this vulnerable side of her, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Regardless of our emotional distance, I couldn't just abandon her in this state. "Rebecca," I said softly, stepping closer. At first, she didn't reply. For a fleeting moment, I thought perhaps she hadn't heard me. But then she slowly lifted her head, revealing a tear-streaked face that caught the light. Her eyes held a mixture of fear, confusion, and something else I couldn't quite identify. Before I knew it, I found myself standing next to her, placing a hand on her shoulder, uncertain of how to comfort her. She flinched slightly at my touch but didn't pull away. Instead, she turned toward me and, without warning, leaned in. It all happened so fast that I didn't have a chance to react. Her lips brushed against mine in a gentle, desperate kiss. I felt her tremble, her breath catching as she pulled back almost instantly, her eyes wide with shock at what had just occurred. Neither of us spoke. Couldn't. My mind was racing. Rebecca, my stepmother, had just kissed me. Felt wrong, completely wrong. Yet in that moment, the gravity of what had just happened hung in the air like a heavy fog, and neither of us knew how to navigate through it. Suddenly, she stood up, the chair scraping harshly against the floor, shattering the silence. "I'm sorry," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Before I could respond, she hurried past me and out of the kitchen, leaving me standing there, stunned and more bewildered than I had ever been. The house now felt colder, emptier somehow, and I couldn't shake the sensation that everything had shifted in a way neither of us could undo. The following morning, everything felt altered. Since the previous night, Rebecca and I had hardly crossed paths. And when we did, it was just a fleeting moment of eye contact before we both looked away. The atmosphere between us felt dense, heavy with unspoken thoughts that neither of us dared to confront. It had been a week since the kiss, and I couldn't stop replaying it in my mind. I wasn't sure if she shared my feelings, but her avoidance spoke volumes. That brief encounter lingered in my thoughts, the warmth of her lips, the urgency in her actions. Yet the confusion that followed made it impossible to understand any of it. Then, one rainy afternoon, I returned home to find her standing outside by her car, gazing down at the ground. For a moment, she didn't notice me as I approached. I considered walking past her, pretending I hadn't seen her, but something within me wouldn't allow that. "Rebecca," I called out. She turned, and before I could process it, she walked toward me, her eyes filled with emotions I couldn't decipher. There was a pause, just long enough for us both to realize something significant was about to unfold. Then, she kissed me again. This time, it wasn't frantic but laden with everything we had been avoiding. Weeks slipped by, but nothing felt quite the same. The kiss hung between us like a shadow we couldn't escape. I tried to dismiss it, to act as though it never happened. Yet the truth was I couldn't. Each time I saw Rebecca, that moment replayed in my mind. The warmth of her lips and the way she looked at me as if we were both stepping over a boundary we knew we shouldn't cross. There was no going back now. Our conversations grew scarce. It was as if the entire house had fallen into a tense silence. My father remained blissfully unaware, engrossed in work and constantly on the go, never noticing the long stretches of silence between Rebecca and me, or how we seemed to evade spending time in the same room. If he did sense it, he never mentioned it. Rebecca, for her part, had retreated deeper into herself. She was present physically but emotionally distant, as if she had locked herself away in some invisible chamber. The worst part was that I felt I should have been relieved we weren't addressing the situation. I should have been grateful we were ignoring what had transpired. But I wasn't. The tension gnawed at me every time I saw her, and I knew it was doing the same to her. One evening, after my father left on another business trip, the silence became unbearable. Rebecca sat alone in the living room, staring at a book she clearly wasn't reading. I lingered in the doorway, uncertain whether to speak up or simply walk away. The room was dimly lit, the only illumination coming from the lamp beside her, casting long shadows on the walls. I stepped forward, clearing my throat, and Rebecca looked up, her eyes widening slightly as if I had startled her. "Rebecca," I began, hesitating. "We need to talk." She gently closed the book and set it down on the table beside her. For a moment, she simply stared at me, and I could see the conflict etched on her face. There was something inscrutable in her eyes, fear, perhaps, or regret, but also an emotion that felt too much like longing. "I know," she finally admitted, her voice so soft I almost missed it. "I've been thinking about it too." Her confession hung in the air between us, thick and heavy. I was at a loss for words, unsure how to proceed, but I realized we couldn't continue pretending nothing had happened. "I don't know what this is," I said, keeping my voice low and cautious, "but it's messing with both of us." Rebecca leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly, as if she had been holding her breath for days. "I've made mistakes in my life, Thomas," she admitted, her gaze fixed on the floor. "A lot of mistakes. But what happened between us?" Her voice trailed off, the words catching in her throat. I took a step closer, feeling the gravity of the moment pressing down on me. I understood I shouldn't be there, shouldn't be standing so close to her. Yet I couldn't pull away. "We both know it was wrong," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't shake it either." That was the truth we had been skirting around for weeks. Neither of us could let it go. The room felt as though it was closing in, the walls urging us together. There was no simple way out of this, no clean break. I could feel the magnetic pull between us, the same pull I had sensed since that first kiss. "What do we do now?" I asked, aware that there were no easy answers. Rebecca didn't respond immediately. She glanced down at her hands, then back at me, her eyes searching for something. Perhaps the courage to voice what we both dreaded acknowledging. But just as she was about to speak, I felt the air change. The tension that had lingered beneath the surface shattered like a wave. "I don't know," she finally said, her voice quivering. "I don't know if there's anything we can do." I hadn't realized how close I had moved until I found myself directly in front of her, close enough to see the tears forming in her eyes. For a fleeting moment, I thought she might stand up and walk away. Yet, she remained where she was, held in place by something invisible that tethered us to this moment. "I don't want to hurt him," she said suddenly, her voice breaking. "Your father? He deserves better than this." Her words struck me hard, and for a moment, guilt washed over me like cold water. She was right. My father, unaware of everything happening in his own home, didn't deserve this. But what could we do? The damage had already been done. I instinctively reached out and took her hand in mine. It was a small gesture, yet it felt like crossing another line from which there was no return. She didn't pull away, and for a brief moment, everything felt suspended, as if we were the only two people in the world. But reality still loomed, casting a shadow over us. There were consequences to our actions, even if we weren't ready to face them yet. The silence returned, heavier this time, as we sat there trapped in the shadow of our choices, uncertain of what lay ahead. Days blurred together, with neither of us willing to acknowledge what had been said, let alone what had occurred between us. When my father returned, he remained oblivious to the tension that had seeped into the walls of our home. Every meal, every shared moment felt like we were teetering on the brink of something irreversible. I tried to avoid Rebecca as much as I could, but it didn't help. She was always there in the kitchen or living room, moving quietly through the house as if she, too, was trying not to draw attention. Yet every time I caught sight of her, that night replayed in my mind. The look in her eyes, the way her voice trembled when she spoke about my father. One evening, after my father had left for work again, I found myself alone with Rebecca in the house. I hadn't intended to speak with her, but when I saw her standing by the window, staring out into the darkness, something shifted inside me. I approached her from behind, close enough for her to sense my presence but not close enough to touch. The silence between us felt suffocating, pressing down on both of us. "We can't keep doing this," I finally said, my voice low. She didn't turn around, but I noticed her shoulders tense. "I know," she whispered, but neither of us moved. The next day felt like everything was hanging by a thread. I wasn't sure if it was just me or if Rebecca felt it too, but the tension had become unbearable. Every time we passed each other in the house, the air felt thick with unspoken words, with something unresolved that neither of us dared to confront. It wasn't until that evening that everything came to a head. My father had gone out for dinner with colleagues, leaving Rebecca and me alone at home. She sat on the couch, flipping through a book she clearly wasn't reading. I stood in the doorway for a moment, observing her as I tried to figure out my next move. I knew we couldn't keep pretending, but I wasn't sure how to address it or if it could even be fixed. "Rebecca," I said softly, stepping into the room. She didn't look up, but I noticed her grip tightening on the book. "We can't keep doing this," I reiterated, echoing the words from the night before. This time, there was no response, only the heavy silence that filled the space between us. I took a few steps closer, feeling the tension rise with each movement. "I don't know what this is," I said, struggling to articulate my thoughts. "But it's killing me." That finally got her attention. Rebecca looked up at me, her eyes wide, as if she hadn't expected me to voice my feelings. For a moment, we were both silent. I could see the conflict in her face, the fear and guilt that had consumed her since our first kiss. Yet there was something else there, too, something that had persisted despite everything. She rose to her feet, the book slipping from her hands, forgotten. "I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice shaking. This isn't right." "I know," I said, stepping closer, "but I can't stop thinking about you, about us." Rebecca took a step back, her eyes filled with confusion, maybe even panic. "We can't," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Your father," I interjected. "I understand, but it's not just that. This whatever is happening between us, it's real. We can't ignore it anymore." For a moment, she just stood there, her breath shallow as if she were struggling to hold herself together. I could see it in her eyes. She wanted to walk away, to put an end to this before it could escalate further. But instead, she did the opposite. She closed the distance between us, locking her gaze onto mine. The room felt as if it were closing in on us, the space between us disappearing as she reached up to gently touch my face. It was a simple gesture, yet it felt like a decisive breaking point. Her touch was soft and tentative, but it carried the weight of all the unspoken things between us. Then, without uttering another word, she kissed me. This kiss was different from the previous ones. It wasn't filled with desperation or fear. It was slow and intentional, as if we were finally surrendering to something that had been building for far too long. It felt inevitable, as if this moment had been destined to happen. No matter how hard we had tried to avoid it, when we finally pulled apart, the room seemed to breathe out along with us. Rebecca's eyes brimmed with tears, yet she made no move to wipe them away. She stood there, breathing heavily, her hand still resting on my cheek. "This is wrong," she whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. "I know," I replied, my own voice thick with emotion. "But I don't regret it." She looked away, her hand slipping to her side. "What are we going to do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I had no answer. How could I? Nothing about this made sense, yet it felt like the only thing that truly mattered at that moment. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, neither of us moving, neither willing to break the silence. Finally, Rebecca stepped back, her face a mask of turmoil. "I need some time," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I need to think." I nodded, even though I knew that thinking wouldn't change what had transpired or how we felt. She turned and left the room without another word, leaving me standing there with my heart racing, questioning how we had let things spiral this far and where it might all lead. The following days were a blur. Rebecca and I barely spoke, and when we did, it was limited to a few awkward pleasantries. It felt as though we were tiptoeing around each other, trying to act as if the last few weeks hadn't happened. But no matter how hard we tried, the weight of everything lingered in the air, impossible to ignore. Rebecca had gone away for a few days, something about visiting an old friend in another town. When she left, a wave of relief washed over me, but it was accompanied by a strange emptiness. I thought maybe her absence would grant me the clarity I needed, a chance to breathe without the suffocating tension. But it didn't. Her absence only intensified my feelings. I couldn't stop thinking about her. In every quiet moment, every time I walked past the living room where we had stood so close, it all came rushing back. Guilt gnawed at me, but so did longing. It made no sense. Nothing about the situation did. Yet I couldn't shake it off. I attempted to immerse myself in work, to hang out with friends. Anything to distract myself from thoughts of Rebecca. But every distraction felt fleeting, like I was merely biding time until her return, waiting for the moment we would have to confront whatever this was between us. When Rebecca finally returned, the atmosphere in the house felt even more charged. She offered little more than a quiet greeting as she passed by me. I watched her go, feeling that familiar tug in my chest, a persistent sense that we were heading towards something beyond our control. That evening, as we sat quietly in different rooms of the house, I realized it wasn't just about avoiding each other. It was about evading the truth that we couldn't undo what had happened. No matter how hard we tried to pretend, it was already too late. When Rebecca came back, the air felt heavier. Neither of us mentioned her absence, but the distance between us had morphed into something more fragile. It was as if the unspoken tension had formed an invisible thread, pulling tighter with each passing day. Deep down, I understood that things couldn't remain this way forever. Sooner or later, that thread would snap. That evening, the house was too quiet. My father was away again, leaving us alone, just like before. I found myself pacing around my room, wrestling with the decision of whether I should talk to her. Really talk to her this time. The avoidance and tension were suffocating me, and I could no longer bear it. I needed to know where we stood, even if it meant everything might change. I walked downstairs, and there she was, sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at a cup of tea before her. She looked exhausted, worn down by whatever had been weighing on her these past few weeks. I hesitated for a moment, but then took a deep breath and sat across from her. "We can't keep doing this," I said quietly, breaking the silence. My voice came out more desperate than I intended. Rebecca looked up at me, her eyes mirroring the fatigue I had noticed for weeks. She didn't respond right away, simply watching me as if she were deciding whether or not to let me in. "I know," she finally replied, her voice barely a whisper. "I've been trying to figure out how to stop this." The weight of her words struck me hard. I couldn't tell if I was relieved or terrified. "Do you want to stop?" I asked, my heart racing as the question lingered in the air. She closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. "We have to," she said, but it felt less like an answer and more like an obligation, something she knew we should do. Yet it didn't sound like it was what she truly wanted. The room felt too small, too close. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, searching for the words to express what I had been holding back. "Rebecca, I don't know what this is, but I can't pretend it didn't happen. I can't just go back." Her eyes snapped open, and she looked at me with a mix of fear and something deeper, something she hadn't voiced yet. "Neither can I," she admitted, her voice breaking. "But if we keep going down this path, we'll ruin everything." There it was, the truth. We had been dodging the devastation that loomed over us, ready to tear apart not just us, but everything and everyone around us. "My father, the family, the life we've all been pretending is so normal," I murmured, feeling the weight of those words. They felt perilous, but I couldn't continue deceiving myself or her. Rebecca rose from her seat, her movements measured and deliberate, as if each step was a choice she wrestled with. She walked over to the window, gazing into the darkness with her back turned to me. "I don't either," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I stood up and approached her, unsure of my next words or actions. All I knew was that I couldn't allow her to walk away from this conversation without some form of resolution. As I reached her side, she pivoted, and we found ourselves face to face, closer than we had been in weeks. "I'm scared," she confessed, her voice quaking. "I'm afraid of what this means and of what we've done." "I'm scared too," I admitted, "but I don't believe we can simply ignore it." For a brief moment, we lingered there, the tension between us intensifying with every heartbeat. The pull between us was palpable, the same force I had felt since the very beginning, pulling us towards something irreversible. And then, before I could reconsider, I closed the distance between us and kissed her again. This kiss was unlike the others. It wasn't fueled by confusion or fear. It was purposeful, laden with all the words we had left unspoken. When we finally separated, she regarded me with a blend of sorrow and acceptance. "This can't continue," she whispered, yet her hand remained on my arm as if she were reluctant to let go. "I know," I replied softly, my voice heavy with the gravity of what had just happened. "But we have to determine what comes next." Rebecca didn't respond. Instead, she turned away, slowly walking out of the room. I stood there, watching her fade into the shadows, fully aware that whatever followed would alter everything, whether we welcomed it or not. The house fell silent once more, an unsettling quiet enveloping us. My father had left early that morning for another business trip, leaving Rebecca and me alone yet again. This time, however, something felt different. The weight of our shared experiences pressed down on me more than ever. I hadn't spoken to her since our last encounter by the window, where our unfinished words still lingered in the air. I replayed that moment in my mind endlessly, how close we had been, how far we had crossed the line. Yet, it seemed we were still nowhere near the conclusion. That afternoon, I heard her footsteps in the hallway. She paused outside my door, as if contemplating whether to knock. I held my breath, waiting, hoping, and to my surprise, she gently pushed the door open, her face partially obscured by the dim light. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice soft and uncertain. I nodded and rose from the bed, unsure of what would transpire next. Rebecca stepped into the room and quietly closed the door behind her. She didn't meet my gaze right away, instead standing there with her hands clasped tightly in front of her, as if trying to hold herself together. "Thomas," she finally said, looking up to meet my eyes. I'm leaving." I froze, initially unable to comprehend her words. "What do you mean?" I asked, confusion flooding my mind. "I need to go," she said, her voice wavering slightly. "I've been thinking about this for a while. What's been happening? It's wrong. We both know that. I can't keep living like this." Her words struck me like a blow to the chest. I felt as though the ground had crumbled beneath me, but I couldn't argue with her. Deep down, I recognized that she was right. We had crossed too many boundaries, and now there was no turning back. Yet hearing her vocalize it was what truly stung. "Where will you go?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She shook her head, tears pooling in her eyes. "I don't know yet, but I have to leave before this gets any worse." I wanted to implore her to stay, to ask her to work through this together, but the words eluded me. There was nothing left to say that could ease the situation. We both understood that this was the only way to halt the downward spiral we had found ourselves in. Rebecca stepped closer, her expression filled with sorrow. "I'm sorry," she murmured, her voice quavering. "I never intended for any of this to happen." "I know," I replied, my throat tight with emotion. "Neither did I." For a moment, we simply stood there, the silence between us heavier than ever. Then, without thinking, I reached out and took her hand in mine. She didn't pull away. She looked at me, her eyes brimming with tears, and in that moment, everything else faded into the background. I leaned in and kissed her softly. It wasn't an elaborate or dramatic farewell. It was a gentle, simple kiss that felt like the final goodbye we could share. There was no rush, no confusion, just a quiet acknowledgement that this was our last moment together. When I pulled back, Rebecca released a shaky breath, her hands still resting on mine. She stepped back, wiped her eyes, and I knew that this was the end. There was nothing more to say. "I'll be gone by tomorrow," she said softly, turning toward the door. "Take care of yourself, Thomas." And just like that, she was gone, slipping out of the room as quietly as she had entered. The door clicked shut behind her, and I stood there, staring at the empty space she had occupied. The silence engulfed me, and I realized that everything had changed. We had reached our conclusion, and there was no turning back.